Welcome back to Varn Vlog Solo. And though it's kind of redundant to call it Vlog Solo, I'll admit that. It's just that while these started off as just blogs, they quickly became an interview show because I like doing interviews. I prefer dialogic modes of building discourses. I mean, even in the word discourse, as opposed to writing prose. Even though I trained to write prose, fancy myself to be a writer, and I write poetry. That's what my MFA is in. But once I got out of school, aside from the kind of writing of curriculum that I have to do in my daily life, and particularly after I quit blogging in 2019, 2020, somewhere in there, I find that I just don't like writing a ton of prose. And that's funny for a guy who's writing 2 books right now. Nonetheless, let's recap a bit. On the last Varn Blog Solo, we talked about how we do have to get into the scientific and physics assumptions as well as the religious beliefs of Hobbes to see what he was truly on about, and why he is both, in some ways, the first person to share, a liberal worldview. Human equality is a given, even though he does still have slavery and whatnot. But he thinks ultimately humans naturally are pretty much equal. There's no recourse to divine justifications for politics. Absolutism is argued in Hobbes out of an assumption about the nature of humans as physical particles. And it even comes down to his views on science and what humans are. And so this is a Gestalt philosophy and worldview. Each of this adds into the West. And parts of it are foreign to us. So when we teach Hobbes, we talk about the social contract, the state of nature, and what his version of the social contract was. And it comes out of a very particular context in the English Civil War. But without understanding the physics that he subscribed to in his early view of science, it's hard to know exactly what he's on about. And it's also interesting how he becomes both one of the first people to have fundamentally modern liberal assumptions in the English-speaking world. Like I said, human equality is taken as a given, secular justification for rule, and he uses it for what is effectively illiberal means, which is to push back on everything that emerged in the bourgeois revolutions of the English Civil War. So Hobbes is the first liberal and anti-liberal simultaneously, even before de Maistre. And why he's key to a kind of anti-liberal tradition that emerges, particularly when he's picked back up by people like Carl Schmitt in Germany, several hundred years later. But we only explore part of this. We have to go into what he thinks human beings are and what he thinks human nature really is. And that's interesting. So we're going to come back to the Alan Ryan book on Hobbes. A lot of this is also in his book on politics. You can see it back there. There we go. That tall thing right there. But this is an expanded form in these little books that came to go with it, with more selections from Hobbes himself. There's lots of chapters in here. All right. So Leviathan begins with a highly persuasive account of human nature and the role of reason in human life. It begins with an account of human nature for both official and unofficial reasons. The official reason is that since the body politic is constructed of individuals, we must know the nature of the parts to know the nature of the artificial man that we shall build. So remember, we have this idea of human beings as a physics, and the atoms make up the human being. Now, we don't really have a fully a complete understanding of cells at this time. This is actually developing contemporaneous to Hobbes. But this is the metaphor. And in some ways, he's also talking about, he takes the metaphor of the church as the body of Christ and the state as the body of the state. And he takes this all very literally. All right. Now, we can debate how literally he takes it, but I think we should read his text, Leviathan Behemoth, at his word. We should not automatically assume that he means everything metaphorically or that he's hiding his atheism or something like that. That is to impose modern readings on him, kind of Leo Straussian reading of Hobbes. The unofficial reason is rhetorical. Hobbes paints a picture of the capacities that human beings possess in virtue of being self-maintaining physical systems that perceive both things outside of themselves and their own bodily states, that feel desires and aversions, and above all, that think. Asterisk. In this way, he's like actually preceding something like the viable systems theory, which sees all systems, from mechanical to biological to social, as having similar structures and chains. All right, that's an idea from cybernetics. It's preceded by several hundred years in Hobbes. And this is why Hobbes is a great, interesting villain for a lot of liberals, even a lot of Marxists, to deal with. Right? Because he's a smart enemy. It's not like picking on Ben Shapiro. Anyway. Then he provides an account of the basic emotions that drive such creatures and more complex emotions that experience and reason create out of the basic ingredients. By imagining many such a creature placed in the environment with no rules, no laws, nobody in authority who is able to make them act in one way rather than another, the so-called state of nature, he is giving a striking account of the problem to which government possessing absolute authority is the solution. It is still known to political theorists and sociologists as a Hobbesian problem of order. And we ask ourselves this. One of the things we'll say, what is that state of nature? Well, equal beings for Hobbes are in competition with each other. They have mimetic desires. They want what each other has, and there's only so many resources to get it. So it leads to a war of all against all. Now, we know from anthropology that from, societies that we can study, and from what we see in primates, this is not true. Humans do not function on a war of all against all in a kinship group. The idea of other mediating structures being innate to human beings is something Hobbes brackets out. And it's partly probably because of his metaphor of what humans are functioning as. Like, he sees all these as basically atomic or cell structures. The atomized man or the atomic man is the cell of the body politic, literally as if the body in the civics is a person, right? And remember, I said this was akin to ancient Stoic metaphysics too, that they believed that everything was inevitable and you had to be brave and just face it, because in some ways everything is the way it has to be because you are proceeding as part of the physical body of Zeus. That's Stoic philosophy. And here we have the body of the body politic, or the king's two bodies, if you want to go into that kind of metaphor, in the body of the church, the sovereign body, and modern science, all blending together in a new framework. One that creates a myth of the social contract. And we have to admit it's a myth, because kinship social contracts do not work at all the way Hobbes envisions them. But he is assuming this based on his model of human beings. And as we discussed in the last episode where I reflected on this, the model of science. All right. This is why when we talk about stuff like Marx, it's actually kind of important to know the Hegelian and Epicurean structures that Marx is operating on for his materialism. It actually is not the same thing, and communists even get this, as empirical or physicalism or metaphysical naturalism or anything like that. It's a more specific kind of material reality. Now, it does assume that there's basically one substance to the universe, and that is matter, but there's more that flows from that structurally from Marx. This is not to say that Marx was like just a pre-Socratic or was just trying to resurrect Epicurean or Lucretian physics. He was absolutely not. He was very interested in modern physics. We know that from historical studies of all kinds of stuff. He was very interested in Darwin, and he was very interested in soil erosion, as Kohei Sato points out. He's very interested in a lot of things. Nonetheless, quote, Hobbes begins from the premise that human beings are complex physical systems, natural automata, endowed with sense, reason, and passions. We are matter. We are natural matter. We are machines. Right? You can actually see this Hobbesian physics going through like new atheism, for example. Although Hobbes wasn't an atheist, not in the way that we think of it. He also wasn't a Christian. He also was. He was a. If he was a Christian, he was a heretical Christian. We'll get to that. Much of his account of our intellectual capacities is an exasperated commentary on the nonsense of the schoolmen, the scholastic philosophers on his own and previous 2 centuries. The scholastic philosophers in the medieval university, which was rising from the 11th century to the 14th century, was declining by Hobbes's time. And after the Civil War in England, it was pretty much, barely existent. This weirdly is tied to the paradox of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a time period where the formal education system around the royal and clerical universities has broken down, and there are new systems emerging, but there's also a new technology corresponding with that in the printing press. So there's its interest in prior forms coming from basically, academic cranks who don't have university gigs. This is to say, when people tell you that everything that is anti-academic is anti-intellectual, they're not being honest, and they don't know history, because ironically, some flowerings of intellectual capacity in various societies happen when sclerotic old institutions that were themselves very innovative in their beginnings start to break down. This is why I talk a lot about decadent cycles. It's actually really important to understand that the breakdown is not just bad. All right. But anyway, these are old battles, but Hobbes' uncompromising materialism and nominalism is still exciting. Reason is not divinely imprinted source of illumination, as it is for like Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus or William of Ockham or any of those people. It is the capacity to calculate consequences. Its task is to calculate the consequences of names, or in modern terms, to draw logical inferences. Predicate logic is what we're really talking about here. Back to the Alan Rand. Words get their meaning because human beings impose names upon experiences they wish to record. So Hobbes is also anti-essentialist. He's not an Aristotelian or an Aquinian or a Platonist. All right. He does not think that names refer to forms that are eternal. The term red, for instance, gets its meaning by being imposed upon the experience of seeing a red thing to remind us that the experience was like seeing another red thing. Right. So we have actually a beginning in Hobbes of a nominalist semiotics. This is not a persuasive theory of meaning in general. It is particularly bad on the meaning of words such as if and. So it doesn't work for syntax. It only works for nouns, basically. But it yields the results that Hobbes needs. If everything is body, the world contains only particular entities. But late medieval philosophy invented all manner of terms referring to the properties of more or less occult sorts. Where names refer to suspect entity, Hobbes sometimes declares them to be unmeaningful or unmeaning. And we have this idea of, non-cognitive or unmeaningful terms in analytic philosophy. And one of the first people who's really dealing with that is Hobbes. All right. Frequently, he makes a very modern move of analyzing them as naming something else. The name of a name, for instance. So we have something like a rudimentary semiotic theory in Hobbes, based again on his physics and the idea that a lot of the metaphysical postulates that the medieval scholastics have come up with were just not worth a damn. Now, this is very Protestant of Hobbes. Remember, but even from Protestant standards, I said Hobbes is a heretic. Um, but it's also very interesting because it is closer to a modern way of thinking. So Hobbes asserts that almost nothing we say about God is really about God. And Hobbes is really accurate. I mean, it's really interesting because God is like a positive, like a projection of our values for Hobbes. So he probably does believe in God, but he doesn't think that when we talk about God, we actually mean it. To call God infinitely good says nothing about how good God is. It only says that human beings cannot say how good God is. Calling God infinitely wise and infinitely powerful is acceptable because the term names the intention to honor God. Infinite is the name of our inability to set limits. Confessing our inability to limit the attributes of God is to honor him or it. This is more skeptical than anything in Aquinas, as I just mentioned. Hobbes rejects the idea of analogical talk. What lies beyond all experience is literally inconceivable. See Wittgenstein. And again, Hobbes is predating that. This leads to an interesting claim. We cannot know whether God wishes us to honor him by praying with our heads covered, as the Jews supposed, or uncovered, as the Christians suppose. But we should worship in a way we all recognize as giving honor. Bareheaded or with covered head. So in Hobbes, we also see this, what I will term a conservative Puranic skepticism, using epistemic humility to argue that we should follow custom because custom shows respect, not because it is true, because we cannot know the truth. This is a kind of conservatism in the way Puranic skepticism is employed. This has an implication for religious liberty and the separation of church and state. On one hand, it suggests that university of worship is a good thing. On the other hand, this is not for religious reasons. In some ways, Hobbes presupposes even things like Leo Strauss's kind of secular justification of maintaining Christianity as a means of maintaining social order, even though, as a conservative but a secular liberal, which Leo Strauss was, religion was for the rubes, but the rubes needed something to believe in. Hobbes kind of doesn't go that far, but he comes close. Everything in the world is particular and everything universal is verbal. So we have something very different from what we see in Hegelian thinking or Platonic thinking or even Marxist thinking. There is no universal for Hobbes except in what is verbalized. So the universal is only a result of language. Hobbes is formally on the materialist, nominalist, and anti-Platonic side in matters of logic. Traditional philosophy must reduce its ambitions. It cannot see the essence of things as Plato hoped. We also see this in Kant. Kant doesn't go like this. Kant is very much not a materialist in this way, but Kant's noumena and the thing in itself is fundamentally unknowable. And Hobbes would probably agree with that. There are no essences. So Hobbes is almost an existentialist, actually. For reason to operate effectively, it must not be dazzled by verbal confusion. Whence the need for meticulous definitions and an end to the unmeaning speech of the schoolmen. But reasoning is social as well as individual. And I would agree with Hobbes on this, and Marx would too. Our opinions can be corrected by other people, and thus the use of reason implies a willingness to defer to other people. You're an atom, but you're deferring to other atomized individuals who can help you. If everyone tries to impose his own ideas on others or define words as he wants, reasoning is as impossible as playing cards would be if everyone declared that the suit to be trumps of which he had most in his hand. Hobbes is not Humpty Dumpty. Words do not mean whatever we want them to mean. He's not uber personal subjectivist relativist. He is a social constructivist in the way words work. And he believes that's because we're all equal, but because we're all equal and we're implied with reason, even though we're basically mechanical matter, we're given reason and thus can reason these things out. And reasoning being social gives us a way to communicate. So there's what we would say in the 20th and 21st century, an intersubjective relation, which gives words meaning. Now, I'm going through all this very slowly to explain the concepts to you because I think you can see how much modern thought is encapsulated in Hobbes, and yet how foreign it feels when we get to the physics and metaphysics of it. Because metaphysics is not the word, the European medieval world, but it's also not ours. Also, there's similar developments in other countries. We could talk about like ancient Dharmic thought and the materialist and Dharmic thought. I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but there are parallels to Hobbes, way before Hobbes. Our legalist philosophy in China parallels Hobbes in a lot of these ways too. We reason for the sake of successful living. We are moved to do so because we are self-preserving creatures and wish to know how to preserve our lives and how to live well. Hobbes despised Aristotle's ethics and politics. So, Aristotle is a kind of looming ambivalent dialectical figure for someone like Marx, but he's an enemy for Hobbes. I also find it funny that Karl Popper never mentioned Hobbes in his, Open Society and its enemies, because Hobbes would probably agree with a lot of Popper's metaphysical assumptions. Hobbes also despised his being Aristotle's physics, but conceded some merit to his biology, which is kind of funny because Aristotle's physics is actually probably better accurate in accuracy than Aristotle's biology. Leviathan was intended to drive Aristotle from the terrain of political debate, but Hobbes silently appropriates his views on many occasions, and our motives for reasoning about the world and ourselves may be one. There is nothing un-Aristotelian about the thought that we are so made that we have a standing desire for self-preservation and a desire to live well, and that the practical reason is the employment of our reason in deciding what to do to secure a good life. That's Aristotelian virtue ethics, actually, is really about that. That's me adding that to Ryan here. If Aristotle's observations are acceptable, the system in which he places them in is not. It is absurd and a font of absurdity for Hobbes. Hobbes' system operates on the mechanical, not the teleological conception of desire and aversion. Something within us drives us to do or away from what we want and wish to avoid. Our desires are explained by how we are constructed, not by ends inscribed in our nature to which we are naturally drawn. So for Hobbes, we are natural automata that are constructed in a certain way to do certain things. And for Aristotle, we have a prime objective to meet what is unique and essential to us, and it is ascribed upon our being. That is, what is our teleology? Well, what is essential to what is human and only unique to human? And for Aristotle, that was reason. I've gone into the different types of reason in Aristotle, but that's where it comes from. Go back and see my nailing it down, which this Varn blog solo is sort of like, but I thinking I'm going to not so much have that distinction anymore. Anyway, back to here. Aristotle's teleological conceptions of human nature is rejected, and when its suggestions that we have a proper or natural ends. Aristotle saw values as inscribed in nature. Hobbes saw values as inscribed on nature by ourselves in light of our desires and aversions, asterisks, which we mechanically have because of the way we were built. So again, Hobbes is far more like a modern materialist than Aristotle is. And if we get into the debates in German idealism, there's definitely people who sound a lot more like Aristotle. Hegel, who's not an Aristotelian, but definitely has an Aristotelian-like teleology, versus, say, Marx, where the teleology is emergent from necessity and history because of the way we are socially inscribed for Marx. But it is material. Anyway, I could go into that distinction more and not let Marx was pulling from Hobbes very much. But he was in dialogue with Aristotle and with Hegelian conceptions of ancient Greek philosophy and philology, good and evil. Hobbes gives a strikingly subjective account of the nature of good and evil and of a vexed subjects, the existence of the ultimate good, the summum bonum. He famously observed that whoever every man desireth, that for his part he calleth good. Good is not the name of the quality of a thing or a state of affairs. It is the name of our desiring whatever it is. And see in this we see a predilection to what would we see later developed in analytic philosophy that's often called emotivism, as I've talked about it before, or something like Nietzsche, where the good is just what we want. It's our will to power. So we see that in Hobbes too. And again, well before Nietzsche, right? What we dislike, we call evil. And what we are indifferent about, we call, in Hobbes' 17th century terminology, contemptible or contemptible. The reality is that our wishes and fears, calling good, is a prior to being good. The things we want, we call good, and happiness consists in getting what we want. This holds only for the most part. Many things are wanted as means to something else, and if they turn out to be wrong or to have bad side effects, so we are mistaken to want them, we shall not be happy in getting what we want. Success consists of satisfying one desire after another, and the greater happiness rather than less is a result of satisfying more desires rather than fewer, discounting for side effects. This is strikingly anti-Aristotelian conclusion, reinforced by another. Aristotle's concept of the ultimate good was associated with the idea that once achieved, it leaves no further longing. So if you've achieved the ultimate good in Aristotle, you are like the unmoved mover. You no longer have desire. It's almost Buddhist in its conceptions. Like it's reached anatraxia. That's not a term that Aristotle, I think, uses, but I'd have to go back and look in the Greek. But it is something that later Hellenistic philosophers coming after Aristotle used. That the goal is to fulfill your teleology for Aristotle so that you live in accordance to reason. And once you live in accordance to reason, your need to desire something else goes away. Aristotle's conception of the good was ultimately associated with the idea that once achieved, it leaves us no further longing. It is the ultimate in all ways, embracing all partial goods and leaving the desiring soul in a state of rest and anatraxia. Hobbes was cautious enough about giving offense to the pious to refrain from mocking the thought so savagely. Nonetheless, he dismissed it and instantly as a thought without any application to the world we actually live in. The reason is that we are a physical systems. And notice we're talking about physical systems embedded in physical systems embedded in physical systems here. The human body is in incessant motion. Our desires are constantly changing, and with them the standard by which we judge our happiness and misery. Well, Hobbes is however to call the felicity of this life, leaving it unspoken but implicit throughout that we can form no clear idea of what the felicity of any other life may be like. So there's a radical subjectivism and even unique qualia here. Consist in satisfying as many of these changeable desires as we can, one by one. There are second order desires, the desires that other desires should be satisfied, and the desires that other people's desires should be satisfied. That is what benevolence is. Among these second order desires, the desire for security is especially powerful. The traditional doctrine of the common good is silently demolished, although a non-traditional account of a very different common good replaces it. So we don't live a common good to live an ideal republic. We live a common good to satisfy our desires. We do not naturally converge on any particular goal. There is nothing that pleases everyone, and nothing satisfies any individual forever. Once a desire is satisfied, another takes its place, and we begin to search to satisfy it. This is very almost proto-Lacanian of Hobbes. This is not to be deplored. Nobody thinks it is gluttony to eat lunch as well as breakfast. The felicity of angels makes no sense to us, though we may hanker after whatever we suppose it to be. The mutability of desire launches two powerful thoughts. The first is Hobbes' analysis of pride. In the modern vernacular, pride is an extreme version of keeping up with the Joneses. It's mimetic competition for Hobbes. Pride is why we seek status advantage for Hobbes. The changeability of our desires means that the standard of how well we are doing comes from within us, but it cannot answer the question of whether we get what we should. What if we habitually do? What if what we habitually do is look at how other people are doing? Mimetic desire. If they do better than we envy them. And they envy us if we do better than they. We come to desire their envy, their admiration, and their knowledge, and their acknowledgement that we are doing better than they. We move from wanting things naturally, in the familiar sense of the term, to wanting them to become what other people want them. We want a bicycle, moving on to wanting a car, and by the end, wanting a car to make the neighbor jealous. Vainglory is the most important emotion in Hobbes' political theory. In the book of Job, Leviathan is a ruler over children of pride. And Job provides both the title and the moral of Hobbes' masterpiece. Non est potesta super tyrannum que compretur e. There is no power on earth that compares with him. God, the author of the Leviathan. Unsurprisingly, one of Hobbes' innumerable critics entitled his attack on Hobbes, Leviathan Drawn Out with a Hook. It is nonetheless an unfortunate title, since the implication of God's invocation of the great whale was that Job could not draw it out with a hook. Hobbes regarded pride as a particular antisocial emotion. Political arrangements had to subdue it if there was to be peace. Pride must yield to its opposite. Man must consider their most important long-term interests and concerns. They must understand that they are fragile creatures for whom self-preservation is an overriding imperative, and think about what behavior promotes self-preservation, not what would impress others. Among consequences disagreeable to traditionally minded aristocrats, two are striking. The first is an insistence on the natural equality of all humankind. In that sense, Hobbes is a liberal. Now, he's using it for illiberal means. That's absolutely true. So we can debate over whether or not he is a liberal. Our liberals are post-Hobbesian. In some ways, that's also giving Hobbes too much credit, because some of the ideas were developing in the scientific cultures of France and England at the time, and both France and England were beginning to truly finish their national consolidation projects and begin what would start the whole Westphalian system later. But here, at this particular time, we have something very specific. There are no natural aristocrats. Aristotle thought exactly the opposite. Just as there are slaves by nature, so best men are best by nature. Right? Aristotle flatters you for thinking you're just good for being who you are, and the people who are lower on the totem pole, they're just inferior. They can't be, they're poorly made things who can't engage in the kind of reason that would be required of a citizen, et cetera, because they're just not good enough. Hobbes says the opposite. Hobbes says, no, we're all basically the same. So Hobbes actually supports an absolute autocracy on the idea of human equity. That is kind of brilliantly devious. And it also pissed everybody off, because you can see, if you're a traditionally minded aristocrat, Hobbes is saying you're not special. You're just lucky in the system that we use to maintain the civic being. Any hierarchy that you have is not inherent. Now that sounds liberal, but remember what Hobbes is using this for. It's to say that we need an ultimate sovereign to control everything but life and death. Hobbes insists that what is meant to be an aristocrat is a matter of what the sovereign authority determines. So we have, even in Hobbes, something that Smith would call the sovereign exception. You know, the inequality in a society is not because people are inherently unequal, but because we need a sovereign to keep us from killing each other. Certain inequalities are tolerated. That's the Hobbesian vision. The crown is the font of honor in the conventional sense, and in a logically more stringent sense, honor is what the sovereign confers. Now, this is incredibly different than early or late medieval political theory. Right? Even though this is absolutist, the idea that the nobility, was special beyond the choice of, beyond the fact that it was, given the right to rule by God, although it wasn't like divine and absolute right, as all aristocrats were given by the virtue of their aristocratic placement, this actually is a shock to them. This is a kind of bourgeois way of looking at the world. Once the two thoughts are put together, we can see that there is no room in Hobbes for a theory of any social group to claim to be the natural right to rule and the virtue of birth and upbringing. Hobbes was not hostile to aristocracy. The Cavendish family employed him for almost 6 decades, and he admired the aristocratic virtues, such as generosity, noblesse obliged, and he had little time for merchants or commercial life. So while he is showing bourgeois habits of mind, he's also anti-bourgeois because he thinks the merchants are just kind of like scummy, overly practical people. He was not hostile to aristocrats, but the idea that there was any natural aristocrat. Hobbes just thinks aristocrats exist because the sovereign says they need to exist. And if the sovereign says it, to keep social peace and to cultivate some virtues for people to mimic in their aristocratic virtues, so be it. They might be a good, we might admire them, but there's no reason why they should be that way innately. That's what Hobbes is saying. That is so different from late medieval thought. The second powerful thought is Hobbes' inversion of Aristotle's search for the summum bonum. There is no consensus on the highest good for mankind, but there is a worse evil, and that is death. We all agree we don't want to die. Everyone has good reason to avoid sudden and violent death at all costs. In absence of the summum bonum, we can agree on the existence of a summum malium, the ultimate bad. Although I don't think Hobbes would have ever saw like David Benatar and the anti-natalist utilitarians who argue that death is a good thing because suffering is worse than nothingness. That death is the worst of all evils is almost a physical truth for Hobbes. As a self-maintaining automata, we are hardwired to reject anything that will bring us to a halt. Hobbes says over and over that we may rationally agree to anything except to get killed. To agree to death for Hobbes is irrational. Because you can see why he was all. This is kind of convenient for a guy who's breaking all kinds of oaths and stuff to stay alive. A promise or a covenant to kill myself or to let myself be killed is void. You cannot agree to your death. This has curious consequences that the coroner's verdict of suicide, while of an unsound mind, is a pleonasm. To kill oneself appears to be insane by definition. It also has some interesting liberal results. One is that we cannot say to our rulers, if I do thus and such, kill me. The most we can say is, if I do thus and such, you may try to kill me, with the implication that we do no wrong if they try to ensure that they do not. So for Hobbes, once the social contract is violated in the attempt of your life, if you overthrow the king and establish yourself as sovereign, that's kind of okay, because the king tried to kill you. That is an interesting thought. But remember, for Hobbes also, consent, even on pain of death, is still consent. So if we have chosen, because this actually leads to an interesting thing. It's like, how can you tell a subject from a slave in Hobbes? And you kind of can't. If we have chosen to give up our freedom to save our life. But if I am at knife point and consent to the ruler, that is still consensual. But if I don't do it, I'm insane. Do you see the kind of paradox Hobbes has set up here? If you consent to the ruler who has bested you to be their subject to save your life, you have consented. But if you don't consent and let's forfeit your life, you are inherently irrational, and that is null and void anyway. Do you see the logic now? It's a logic trap that Hobbes has set you up. There's no way not to consent to the sovereign, but to consent to the sovereign, even at knife point, is still consent. Do you see the trick? Having established sudden and violent death as the ultimate evil, Hobbes inverts much else of Aristotle's view of politics. We come together to establish political community, not out of a sociable impulse to pursue the good life in the common, but out of an unsociable fear of one another, and for the sake of avoiding the greatest of all evils, death. Without a state, we have no pleasure, but much grief in keeping company. And this, I hate to say, anthropology actually would back Aristotle over Hobbes. We have always come together out of pro-social survivability, not because we are afraid of each other, but because we are afraid of everything else. And we're relatively weak without each other. Hobbes assumes asocial human impulses. We have evidence to the contrary. This is not to say that humans are automatically cooperative or competitive. Anyone who's ever studied anthropology, even kinship anthropology, would know that they are both. That demarcation between competitive and cooperative is ultimately false. Your number one possible enemy is your affinal kin. Your number one possible competitor is your equal in kinship, your brother. And in a lot of traditional societies, this is actually kind of acknowledged. We also know that Hobbes' state of nature does seem to describe competition between groups, but not competition between individuals. So tribes and cities and nations act the way Hobbes says individuals do. But individuals clearly do not. We come to a social contract not so much out of sovereignty, but out of a notion of kinship. And kinship here being both metaphorical, symbolic, and sanguine or literal relation. So I've been praising Hobbes a lot for his insights, but his fundamental assumptions are not anthropologically valid. But to put it back in its context, if I just survived the Civil War the way that went on in England, I might actually maybe think that humans were in a state of awe against Saul when the government broke down, because I just saw that. But he's not seeing that when the government's breaking down, other social structures have broken down too, because the government in some ways is an extension of those other social structures, where the extension of those social structures at scale changes the nature of what they are. Like, we can argue that the ideas of nation and race are based in kin affiliation and the symbolic notions of kinship. That I use some superficial mythology like skin color or hair color to decide that this person is probably related to me. And that impulse is the impulse of both civic cohesion, or social cohesion, or clan cohesion, but also xenophobia, and by extension, eventually racism and social chauvinism, etc. But for Hobbes, this is not the case. The case is I'm afraid of other people because we're not inherently social, and therefore I should commit to the sovereign so that I can be free to be left alone and live with others in a safe way. We can mutually benefit with each other because the threat has been neutralized by the existence of the sovereign to enforce the law. There's all kinds of problems with this. They're pretty obvious, but that's the assumption. This is not to say that once a state is established, the purpose is exhausted by the protection of life and limb. Hobbes is insistent that a state exists to promote what he calls commodious living. And commodious living includes all the pleasures and benefits of civilized life, certainly starting with law and order, but continuously through economic prosperity and on the benefits of learning and the pleasure of friendship and sociability. So Hobbes does see humans as capable of all the good things that saying humans do out of kinship, but he's saying they can only do it when there's a sovereign who said, "Hey, quit fucking fighting and start getting along," and we go, "Okay, yeah, we'll do that now, and we can enjoy all this stuff and accumulate our what Marxists would call means of production and enjoy social reproduction and the meaningful satiation of our desires." Because the threat of violence, at least within our own society, has been called off. Now, this doesn't deal with the fact that there's not one singular sovereign in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the kind of ideal type Hobbes is dealing with. Now, remember, I've already said that his social contract is based on an antisocial view of what human individuals are. And while I think there is something to the idea that humans are often have mimetic desires, that we want what other people want because we model what we do and what other people do, I think it is false to think that is the only thing driving what we do. There are countervailing human tendencies. We don't eat each other's babies very often, compared to even other primates. I know that sounds like a ridiculously obviously thing to say, but it's not obvious in the animal kingdom. Even human males who do show more hostility to people who aren't their genetic offspring in some ways will actually raise kin that are not theirs. All the time, before the imposition of society making them. It is not a creature of law that we do that. Law actually proceeds from that impulse, it doesn't dictate it. Many of the goods that Aristotle assumes as the point of the state's existence reoccur as products of the state's creation. But distinctly political good of ruling and being ruled is in turn not one of them. Hobbes despises the suggestion that the state exists because human beings are naturally social or political animals. See Aristotle. In the Aristotelian sense, he says, misrepresenting Aristotle, men are not political creatures as bees or cattle are, coming together by natural impulse. States exist artificially, set up by agreement among individuals with strong views, with their own right and in terms of association. So Hobbes does not believe humans are inherently social, that we only become social because we agree to it, and thus the basis of the social contract. And the social contract is submitting to the sovereign. Now, we've already seen the kind of double bind he puts you in where there's no way not to submit to the sovereign and be rational, because to not submit to the sovereign is probably death. Well, you can't agree to that. So you're automatically irrational, and your irrational choice is invalid if you choose it. Therefore, you must submit to the sovereign. There's no way out. Conversely, for Hobbes, there's no sense that politics emerges out of man's sociability or kinship, but the opposite. Man's sociability or kinship is established by the force of politics. Now, for antisocial weirdos, I'm sure this is appealing, but there's very little anthropological data that would back this up. Now, we could say, oh, anthropology assumes a lot of norms. It's very weird based. It's an imperial project. All that's true, but it still doesn't change what we observe in hunter gatherers and pastoral societies and agricultural societies, and what the evidence of early human evolution indicates. We were never solitary. We do not function well solitarily. A chimpanzee, which is also not a solitary animal generally, can rip us to shreds. Our nearest primate relative can rip us to shreds. How do we overcome them? But through sociality. We don't eat each other's babies very often. Not never. But we don't eat in-group babies very often anyway. Aristotle pointed out precisely this, but whereas Aristotle thought man was a political animal intended by nature to live in a polis, Hobbes was a thoroughly modern thinker who repudiated the idea that nature has any purpose for us whatsoever and emphasized that we are driven into political society. But that's a false binary. Like there could be no purpose and we still be social because it gave us an advantage to be social before any concept of sovereignty. That's the key. That's why Hobbes is not particularly correct, but why he's so appealing. Anyway, the consequence is that for Hobbes, it is no loss if we live in a wholly private lives and take no interest in politics. In fact, that would be good. It would be smart if we didn't take interest in politics. And I actually tend to agree that if things are working well and you're not being oppressed and society is able to generate general prosperity, we are less political. Why do you need to be? While for Aristotle, it would be a truncated existence suited to women and slaves, but not to citizens, not to men. Let's go back we'll do one more little bit here because I'm liking pulling off this reflection on Hobbes and making some points about the beginnings of liberal thought. With this apparatus and these glimpses of where the argument will go, we can follow Hobbes as he first plunged mankind into the miseries of the state of nature, shows them the way out of those miseries, and elaborates the consequences for well-constructed and well-conducted state. Men are rational and self-preserving, in touch with the physical world through the medium of the senses. Their language names experiences and allows them to record and anticipate past and future experiences. Pretty modern thinking in many ways. On these premises, Hobbes erects a wholly secular and arm's-length account of religion. The natural basis of religion, as distinct from revelation, is that men come to a belief in God through anxiety about causes. We constantly try to discover the cause of events that concern us, that preceding events on which they follow. Knowing causes allow us to control events. Following the claim of causes backwards, we reach the thought of a cause from which all latter events flow. The first cause, the prime mover. So you see here Hobbes almost systemically deconstructing Aristotle. All right. The first cause we call God. Belief in God is so defined, it is almost devoid of content, save that it is impossible that we should think any being is capable of creating the universe without thinking that it is exceedingly, quote, infinitely powerful and has our fate in its hands. Two notable features of Hobbes' discussion are his insistence that religion is a matter of law, doctrines allowed, and his constant animadversions against the self-interested overreaching of the priests of the Catholic Church, quote, and even in that church that hath presumed most of the Reformation. So Hobbes is thoroughly Protestant, and he's kind of mad that Protestants aren't Protestant enough. And he's got this idea of natural religion that is almost deistic or even atheistic, but he does kind of think God is real, and I'll get into that. What of those who disbelieve in the existence of God? Hobbes says they are fools, but not sinners. Sin is a rebellion against the divine law, but those who do not believe in a lawgiver cannot be bound by his laws. That's interesting. See, for Hobbes, the heretic or the atheist is not a sinner. They never agreed to the laws. They're not bound to the laws. They're idiots who refuse to accord to a sovereign. The greatest sovereign, the prime mover, the first cause. See Hobbes' very Protestant way of thinking here? God may destroy them as enemies, but he cannot punish them as disobedient subjects. We are fools to disbelieve because it is imprudent to take risk with omnipotence. Hobbes' view that fear is the passion to rely on is not only the observation that governments must be able to frighten the recalcitrant into obedience, it is also the thought that to turn ourselves into law abiding citizens and morally decent individuals, we must look to the roots of law and ethics in our need for security. We are encouraged to see the good sense in being on the safe side in the matter of belief in God. This is a fear based politics. You know what I think about relying on fear, but that's Hobbes' whole presumption is we live in a physical war with physical automata. We know that things have causes. Our understanding of causes gives us power over them. So we try to the first cause, which is God. God is also our first sovereign. So we submit to God. Those who submit to God are sinners, are non-sinners, meaning they violated the contract. Those who don't may be enemies of God and can be punished by God, so forth, but they are not sinners in the proper sense because they have not consented to be under God's law in the first place. Now, you can see how this is interesting. It mirrors his ideas of what state sovereigns are. It's based in his basically spiritual physicalism or spiritual materialism, and that he really does believe even the spiritual in the world is basically material. God is the first cause of what we think causes all causes, and thus must be infinitely big, and we honor him because he is omnipotent. But there's no reason to believe out of revelation that that we know that he exists. Anyway, mankind is in the state of nature, has the intellectual capacities of civilized man, and is only deprived of government. So for Hobbes, the primitive is not primitive because they're stupid. They're primitive because they haven't submitted to a sovereign and thus have the freedom to develop their capacities. They're using all their thinking to survive. There's actually some interesting things to think about this. This is kind of an interesting truth. Like humans do better on tests when they're not stressed out. And constantly being afraid of death stresses you out. The state of nature is not a primitive or historical condition, it is a theoretical construct, and that's important. He's not assuming that humans in prior ages are dumb. And I mean, for all that I'm pointing out the kind of traps that Hobbes has laid for you to kind of accept his argument, it's interesting how this is fundamentally different than a lot of other more teleological views of humanity. This is not a progressive view of history, except that in so much that our sovereignty has enabled us the peace to materially build ourselves for Hobbes. Among the qualities of natural man, the most important, it's a desire for power. Hobbes, like Nietzsche. This is not specifically political power. Power in Hobbes' understanding is a label for the capacity to control future events. It is labeled to be able to do things that you can predict in the future. Our present resources for controlling the future constitute our power. Anxious creatures like ourselves must want power. Once we have eaten, we wonder where our next meal will come from. We need power over food we shall need in the future. So this is not power in the sense of like puissance or like the ability to force your will in Nietzsche. This is the power to predict events and control yourself, so that things are regular because you can control it. That is the power that Hobbes is talking about. It is both like Nietzsche and not like Nietzsche, because his definition of power is actually kind of broader. Coercion is only part of power because coercion enables you to predict events. If I gather food from bushes, but only if I can be sure of coming back and not finding them stripped up by others, can I be sure of my next meal. I need to control the bush's fate. Hobbes thinks that we move swiftly from power over inanimate things to power over people. What happens depends on what other people do, so controlling them is key to all control. Control over other people is the core of any account of power because people are the most unpredictable element for Hobbes. Hobbes insists that all of us have this relentless desire for power upon the earth that ceases only in death. This is not because we are power hungry or full of immoderate appetites, but because we are driven to acquire power to protect ourselves. So Hobbes does not assume that people are malicious. because they are evil. He assumes people are malicious because of the paranoia of the need for protection. And again, there is some insight there. It is essential that Hobbes could argue that the most individuals we are ready to live modestly and have a moderate age in life. And yet, under the wrong conditions, they would behave as if they were power hungry, aggressive, and immoderate. If everyone was power hungry by nature, there would be no hope of establishing a government. So Hobbes is not, he doesn't have a pro-social view of what humans are, but he doesn't assume humans are evil. This is not because fallen man. So this is also weirdly not from like Catholic Christianity at all. If nobody cared about his own safety, politics would be unintelligible. Secure people will not seek to dominate others, but insecure people will be forced to try for the sake of survival. And I think there is some truth to that. But remember, Hobbes is seeing sovereignty as the only way out of this. There's no other bond or mutual protection that would enable this to be established. Yeah, and that therein where the rub really lies. And power is essentially comparative. If we both want to exercise control over some part of our nature, the one who can make the other yield has real power. So we are forced to try to acquire more power than others. We are forced to try to acquire more power, and others are forced to acquire more power than us. It's a safety mechanism. It's like an arms race. We're in an arms race, haha. Our prisoners still in there. Even though we may all wish to escape it. The implication for modern nation states engaged in literal arms races are very obvious. The sources of power are innumerable. Strength, obviously, but riches, wisdom, and honor are all power for Hobbes. Whatever allows us to bend other people's will to our own. But in the state of nature, this leads to no good. Hobbes provides a wonderful, morbid account of what he describes as the natural condition of mankind as touching their felicity. Otherwise, the miseries of life without government, in which he spells out the effect of living in an environment where there are no rules and no means of enforcement. The problem is that not only are there no authority that can make us behave in one way or another, there is also no common judge of right and wrong. Under government, we know who owns what. We can dictate what happens to this money or these goods or this field. Absent that, none of us have any reason to think that he has less right to anything than anyone else. As Hobbes bleakly says, in these conditions, we all have a right to everything, even to use one another's bodies. It is a right that nobody can make use of. What we lack is a mechanism for allowing the determinate rights that we can make use of. Recall that Hobbes said, whatsoever each man desires for his part, he calleth good. My own survival is good to me, but perhaps not to you. Your paying your debt to me is good to me, but not to you. We can all understand that if there was a common judge who can decide on our rights and duties, we would be better off, insomuch as we would be in less danger of sudden and violent death. To get us to fully appreciate this point, Hobbes spells out what we are logically forced to do in the absence of a common judge. Hobbes says that there are three causes of quarrel, causes of war of all against all. There are competition, diffidence, and vainglory. Competition is self-explanatory. If we are all anxious about securing resources in which our own survival depends, and there can be no mechanism to provide that security, we have to grab what we can, and that can only be at another's expense. It is equally easy to see how government can cure the problem. Under government, the clear rules about ownership means we know how lawfully to acquire the means of life. Only in extreme conditions we may be driven to seize what belongs to another lest we starve. Diffidence or mutual fear is hardly more complicated. But it leads directly into the reasons why 20th century international relations theorists rediscovered Hobbes after World War II. And I actually do think Hobbes's model does work out for states. I don't think it works out for individual humans. But states do actually kind of act like Hobbes would predict us to act. But retrojecting down from the state to the person is actually a hold apart fallacy. But there's lots of hold apart fallacies in Hobbes. Hobbes thinks everything is like mirrored physical systems that build up basically, until you get to God. Hobbes's claim was that the logic of interactions between self-interested individuals who can kill one another tends to violence. The argument was reformulated in the 20th century by the mathematically minded strategic theorist, aka game theorist. Hobbes's premise is that each individual possesses the ability to injure and, at least in last resort, to kill any other human being. The strongest man is vulnerable to the weakest when asleep, or when there's more people who outnumber him. That doesn't even occur to Hobbes. We'll get back to that. Or it doesn't occur to Hobbes here, and it's hypothetical. And this myth that he's constructed. Since we all know this, we all have reason to fear everyone else. The only conditions under which we are safe from another person is that he is disabled from killing us. The most effective way of disabling him is to kill him. Since we are all rational, we can calculate that all the persons have a reason to kill us, and in the absence of a deterrent, may do so. That they have reason to kill us stems from a combination of fear and rationality in the absence of a deterrent. If they fear we may kill them, their only recourse is to strike first. Prisoners, kind of. There is no government to deter us by threatening us with punishment, nor to deter them. We have no desire to strike, but we may feel forced to do so. This is the situation in international sphere when the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to take out the other side's weapon, but not enough to survive a strike with enough weapons to retaliate. Each side had a strong incentive to attack first, however little it might want to do so in abstract. Mutually assured destruction, the alarming name given to the policy of acquiring enough weapons and protecting enough from attack to maintain a second strike capacity, made both sides safe. Once each side could retaliate, neither had an incentive to launch the first strike. Since each knew that about the other, the motives tending to peace were reinforced. What makes the story relevant is that the individuals cannot develop a private second strike capacity. To put it another way, a state with a second strike capacity is not killed if it is attacked, but it can retaliate. The individual who is killed cannot retaliate, although his kin can, and that is something Hobbes just doesn't figure in at all. Anyway, we need to state to provide us with second strike capacity. States do not need supernatural state in the same way, though small states may form alliances with more powerful states to provide it, hence the beginnings of multipolarity. You can see a lot of modern thought here. The emphatic rationalism implied by Hobbes' view of science makes all the difference to his argument. If we question whether human beings can survive without a government is a simple empirical question, the answer is that in many parts of the world they do. And Hobbes well knew. Rules are accepted and observed by everyone in absence of formal mechanisms for announcing them and enforcing them. Families and tribes and hunter-gatherer communities with little formal authority, they do not live very peacefully, but they rarely fall into terminal fratricidal conflict. They live peacefully until they encounter another group. But no member of such a group would think his life was worth a moment's purchase if he found himself among strangers, precisely because they would not acknowledge the rules of forbearance towards him that his family and neighbors would. So what Hobbes is placing on the state, anthropologically, we would place on symbolic kinship bonds, like we have accepted someone into the tribe. Hobbes wants to show us that the implications of removing government from our society, which is to say, the kind of society that had experienced the English Civil War of the 1640s, it is not a society where family-level forbearance and sanctions of primitive society would suffice. So Hobbes is actually kind of moving the goalpost here, but he's saying basically that, like, at our state, if we have let other social forbearances go down, or at least that's implied here. That in the absence of the state, without those other symbolic social forbearances, and since we are kind of atomized, then we do break down into mutual chaos. And I think there's some reasons to believe some people would do this and some reasons to believe others wouldn't. But how we know that is an interesting question. So the Hobbesian calculus is not totally solved by the fact that you just point out that, no, that's not true, that everybody needs a state to do this. The final reason for conflict is not on all fours with competition and deference. Competition can be assuaged by prosperity when we can earn a living by hard work and intelligence. And our willingness to seek our living that way rather than by violence is much increased by the existence of law and its enforcement. And law, I would also point out, law exists outside of the state. Religious laws are probably older than state-based laws, and they're definitely more consistent. Although, I mean, we can get into arguments about what religion is, which is in itself a very nebulous concept and kind of comes from Western ideas of Christianity. and maybe in the Islamic hate world, there's similar ideas. You get outside of that, things get a little bit weird. Fear may be reduced to almost nothing when we all know that everyone else has a reason not to assault us. Pride is different. We have seen how pride results from the combination of the instability of our desires with the ability to compare our successes with those others. So it's mimetic desire that's a problem for Hobbes. That's what really makes this a big deal. It is a source of an unremitting urge to come top, no matter what competition is about. In any competition, there's only one top place, and the competition for it cannot be diluted by prosperity. Pride makes men overestimate their capacities and take foolish risks. It leads men to be obstinate when they would preserve the peace by being willing to give in gracefully. Although it's interesting because, as I've said, states actually act this way more than individuals do, which kind of implies, since states go to war with each other, which kill individuals, a Hobbes solution isn't actually a solution because there's more than one state. Hobbes solution would only be a solution if there was one world government. It's interesting because I think that's missed. It leads them to seek occasions to increase resentment felt by their competitors, and when peace suggests we should soothe their feelings. The cures replied are twofold. The first is that the sovereign is understood to be the font of honor, and that all understand their social status to be the sovereign's gift. So we all depend on the sovereign, and we can become aristocrats because we placated the sovereign, and that's good for Hobbes. The other is simply to repress the expression as far as possible. Leviathan is the king over the children of pride. So we see in Hobbes both thought that is fundamentally foreign to us, views of physics that are fundamentally foreign to us, views of sociality that maybe we wouldn't believe today and would have scientific reasons not to. But there's also a lot of insight into this. What Hobbes says about men and fear in what states of absolute competition and zero-sum games are, that stuff is true. And even I will say, even though I don't think the state is necessary or the sovereign is necessary because people will make abstraction sovereign, it does seem like some kind of social enforcement is necessary for kinship bonds to be in place to mitigate against natural fears of others killing us. But I don't think we actually totally live in anxiety in a state of nature, and the state of nature is totally hypothetical. It is a myth. There is nobody who set out to found a social contract, although when you read people like Locke, you'd think someone believed it, but it's just not the case. I hope this clarifies Hobbes. I'm going to go back to these kinds of, going back to earlier political thinkers, because as much as I try to get people to understand, leftist political theory, maybe understanding political theory at all and where it emerges from, the kind of related logics that these thinkers go through and why they came to them. Because biography and material conditions as manifested in biography, are really important to understanding this. There are reasons why Hobbes thought this, other than like a perverse thought experiment, that are tied up to his views about science and epistemology, but also the world he was coming out of, which was both very much in turmoil, but very much developing both scientific expressions and also where traditional modes of legitimacy were going away. But he just lived through a civil war and wanted to come up with a reason to submit to the royalists so that it doesn't fucking happen again. All right. I hope this gives you a way to think through beginnings of liberal modernity's politics, at least as it manifested in the English-speaking world. The English-speaking world probably gives itself too much credit. It definitely does, actually. But Hobbes is an answer here. And people who just think it's about his social contract and nasty Brutus in short don't get everything in it. It's a much richer, much more modern, and also still yet very foreign to us way of thinking. That tension should sit with us for a while. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell.